Hi, my name is Mary Catherine Thane, and today I'm going to be talking about Ender's Game. And also, just so y'all know, I'm a little sick right now. My throat is not feeling great, so this is gonna be a process. So, Ender's Game is a really well-written book, and I really like it. And it's a pretty well-known book as well. It's been made into a movie and lots of other stuff. It's a Hugo winner and a Nebula winner, and a New York Times bestselling author wrote it, who is Orson Scott Card. It's a really good book, and I think a lot of people have read it. A lot of people know about it. It's pretty good. So I started reading it, and I finished it and all that stuff. And I think it's a really well written book. It's just, I can't decide if I like it or not. Don't get me wrong, it's entertaining and all that stuff, and I read it in like 2 days. Like, it's a good book. It's just I don't know if I like it or not. The story is based around a boy named Ender, who lives in a world where they've had an alien attack, and they're sort of readying their army for another one. And he is a third, which means he is the third child of a family, and you're only really supposed to have two. But the government allowed his family to have three because their first two kids showed really good promise for being like the savior of the world for when the next alien attack happens. So his name is Ender. He goes to, in the beginning he's like going to school and stuff, and like all this stuff, He has two siblings, one named Valentine and another named Peter. Peter was the first one who showed like really great promise, and he almost made it into the pilot thing, but he was shown to be too aggressive and hot-headed. And then Valentine was the sister. They hoped that if it was a girl, she would be more mellow, but in the end it turned out she wasn't fit to be the savior either. So they authorized the parents to have another kid, and that is Ender. So after a couple of main events, he gets bullied a little bit because he's a third, and that's unnatural and stuff. It turns out he's accepted into this piloting academy thing, and he has to go through rigorous training and just a lot of stuff where he's thrown into it. He's 6 years old in the beginning, keep in mind. And he has to go through all these trials, and it goes through his experience in the academy and all that stuff, and his progression, and sort of the psychological stuff that his leaders and these scientists do on him to make him become what they need in the savior. And all in all, it's really well written. I really enjoyed it. It was a very adventurous kind of book, and it was very good at describing, and I really enjoyed it, especially the little parts that they would do with the scientists, showing what they were doing, why they were doing it, their thought process, and that kind of thing. But I think my two favorite characters were actually the siblings, which are Peter and Valentine. Peter is a little bit hard to explain. I said that he was kicked out of the piloting thing because he was too aggressive and hot-headed. And throughout the book, you get to see more of that side of his personality. He is not mentally stable, and he bullies Ender a lot. Like, crazy a lot. Like, he threatens to kill him. So Peter's pretty crazy, but I think he's a really well-written character. Now, Valentine, on the other hand, is the calmer, more sane version of Peter. She thinks things out, and she's sort of Ender's lifeline in a lot of ways, because his parents are, a little bit embarrassed at having a third, and Peter hates him, and, it's sort of just that thing. The relationship between Valentine and Ender is beautiful, and it goes on for the entire book, and it helps him psychologically in a lot of ways. But part of the reason that I'm a little bit on the fence about whether or not I like this is Valentine is pretty much the only female we get to meet who actually has a personality and that kind of thing, which is not bad necessarily. How they explain it in the book is that it is not often that females are invited into the program because they tend to be more compassionate, and in order to have someone like the savior, the person they need to save the world from the aliens again, is someone who isn't afraid to risk people's lives and that kind of thing. And, that line sort of threw me for a loop, but I came to terms with it. But it's also just, the book itself is interesting. All the things that the scientists justify as doing to Ender is to make him this a little bit cold-blooded, but ultimately very strategic and thoughtful fighter, is a little disturbing, especially when you remember that he's literally 6 in the beginning of this book and he breaks like a kid's arm. Like, that actually happens. And they justify it by, it's the psychological building of Ender to make him the thing that they need. And so, just that kind of idea, I think, was something that very much intrigued me, that I thought about while reading this book, thought about after reading this book, and it was really the part that struck me as slightly horrifying, but also very interesting. But the thing that really threw me off was the ending. And if you're planning on reading this book, I would recommend stop listening for a second while I discuss the ending. But the ending is a little weird to me. It makes sense in the context, but it felt a little empty. So the ending is basically that he has been moved on, he is the savior, he knows that he is the savior, but he's doing all of these fighter, what are they called? Like, pretend fighting sequences, like with a computer. And this last one is the big test. It's the one that'll prove if he can be the savior. And in the end, it turns out that the computer-generated battle was the real thing, and he ends up, like, killing tons and tons and tons of people. And the way that they justify it is that he, as a person, would not choose to sacrifice that many people unless he thought it wasn't real. Now, like, I understand that, and of course that's from the weird, cold-blooded scientist part of this whole story, which honestly is one of the most interesting parts of this story. But at the same time, it's sort of interesting how Orson chose to end it. Because it just seemed a little bit like he was trying to convey something else. And during the whole thing, you expect the ending to be this huge battle in, like, space, and he has to fight all the aliens, make a few hard decisions, but in the end, he does it, it's cool, it's great. And that's not what happens. And it leaves you a little bit, like, in shock. And I don't think that's bad necessarily. It's just, it caught me very much off guard. And after, of course, he realizes that it was the real thing, that he did kill a lot of people, he essentially recluses himself. And, which is I think that's a very in-character thing that he did. And it makes a lot of sense. But also at the same time, it's not really the ending you're expecting. So those are just sort of my key, not problems with it, but sort of the reasons why I'm not like, this is so good, you have to read it, like, it's so good, like, it's just, it's good. It is very well written. I enjoyed it. I read it very quickly. and I think he's a very good author. Not that my say should determine that, but all in all, it's a very well written book. You know, it took me by surprise multiple times. I think the psychological and sociological aspects of it are very interesting and very worth going into and looking at. And you know, I might actually finish the series. We'll see what happens. I did really like it. I really like Valentine. She's one of my favorite characters. I'm very excited to see more about Peter's development because he's doing some weird things on Earth. And you know, all in all, I would highly recommend you give it a read. It might not be necessarily what you're expecting, but I really enjoyed it. And let me know in the comments what book I should do next, what book I should read, and any writing tips or anything that you want to hear from me about. Love you. Bye.